So, we've talked about love as a major attribute of God. What are the other kind of core, important attributes that are kind of should be a priority for us to know, you know?
Well, I feel some of those qualities are a part of love. So if we try to separate the qualities that are a part of love to the qualities that are actually love itself, I feel the next there's two more probably of the highest possible qualities that we need to actually absorb from God. So I believe that truth is a quality that can be absorbed from God, and while it may not be a substance necessarily, it exists in its own right, there is also the potential of it being a substance that you can receive from God. Right? But humility is another quality that we can receive, I believe, from God as well. And
when you say receive, you mean come to learn about that attribute within God?
No, I mean actually
receive.
Yeah, actually have a part of that quality enter you from God. Does that make sense? So, for example, in our previous discussion of truth, I said that truth can exist without an emotion, but there is the potential, again, of truth inside of God being some kind of emotional thing that happens that is the basis of all of God's knowledge. Does that make sense? Like some kind of thing that exists inside of God that is emotional in nature that can give us all the knowledge of the universe if we are able to connect to it. And humility, I'm not sure whether God has that as a quality myself. I don't know whether God needs that as a quality. I know, for example, what we would define as humility, God certainly has. And when I say that, for example, God has made a lot of obviously very powerful, beautiful things in the universe. One of the things God made was you. In the process, who is also potentially being a powerful and beautiful thing, right? And God made you with the ability to actually not listen to God at all. Now, that requires humility to do that, if you think about it. Like, to actually create something that you have all this amazing knowledge enough inside of you to create, and then to allow that thing to demonstrate potential anarchy must require of the person creating a large degree of humility, a large ability to let go, a large ability to not control, a large ability to just allow things to happen.
But if God is all love, that would be natural, would it not?
Of course. This is why, do you argue that humility is a part of love, or do you argue that it's a separate thing? Now, my feelings are that humility and truth are separate things to love. And the reason why is that a person must first have humility before they can absorb any new truth. And a person must absorb new truth before they can be in a condition of receiving love. So, for example, when you first met me, you had to allow yourself to absorb the potential truth that God exists as an entity. Before then, you thought that God didn't exist at all, but you knew there were some questions that you had unanswered. But you had to have enough humility to decide that, there are questions that I have not answered, and I can actually make an experiment where I can attempt to answer those particular questions. And that requires humility. It also requires a desire for truth. You have to desire truth more than you desire your own ego, your own desire for self, or your own desire to be viewed by anybody around you as powerful or knowledgeable or any of those other things. And so I do believe they are separate qualities. Yeah. There's another quality I feel God has that is a separate quality, which is power. And there I'm talking about universal power in terms of, if you look at everything that's created in the universe, from the laws right the way across to the physical things, the entities, every single entity God has ever created and all of the laws, they all have power inherent in them, right down to even atomic and subatomic levels that we've discovered at this point in time on Earth. They still have power inherent in them. And if you try to pull those bonds apart, you realise how much power you need to actually destroy the power that's in them. So therefore they have power inherent in their connection. So power must be also another quality that it's a part of God's nature. That is a separate part to love in terms of that can exist. Now, when I say a separate part to love, it's probably the wrong way of saying it, because my feelings are that nothing can actually exist in God's nature without love being inherent in it. And in fact, everything that I've discovered at this point in time about God has always had love inherent in the quality. And for that reason, I've been able to base all experiments that I've had with God on this aspect of love first, more than anything else. I feel when people try to experiment with God without love being involved, then you're not going to discover very much about God at all, because God's primary quality, it appears to me, is love. And therefore, that being the case, it would make sense that every other thing that God has ever had as a part of her nature has also love as its underlying basis. So power, for example, is a loving quality that God exercises. On earth, there is very, very little love in power. And in fact, most of the time power is exercised very unlovingly here on earth. God only exercises power in a loving manner. With the way God accesses humility. On earth, we often see so-called humility, which is more what I would place as a deference to others and a putting down of oneself. That's not humility. That's not the kind of humility God has. God doesn't put down herself or himself. And it's not, so I don't describe that as a part of that quality. So with regard to truth, there are many things on earth that man thinks are truth, but what I'm talking about here is what is the absolute truth on any one subject. So the absolute truth on any subject, for example, the subject of colour, can be determined to a large degree by looking at what goes on in the majority of people. Now, of course, there are people who are colour blind, who see different colours. But all of us see the colour or the shade of white, or a bright colour like so. We also all see the colour of black, and we can all agree on those particular colours generally, or if we could call them shades, would probably be a better term. And so therefore there's a truth involved that all of us observe that is consistent across all of us. Now, it doesn't mean that an animal sees it the same way. It just means that all of us see it this way, and we will interpret it in our brains a certain way. Now, as to why a person who is colourblind, which is a genetic problem, can only see a certain thing as a different colour, it's really yet to be discovered as to why on earth, why that's the case. But we know that a person who's colourblind doesn't fit the norm. And we know that the norm is to see certain colours a certain way, and then a person who's colourblind, because of some kind of genetic issue passed down through the genes of the mother, in this case, they see a colour differently. And we know that there must be some kind of genetic mutation that's occurred there that caused them to see something differently. And so we can determine the truth of a lot of things physically through that process of just examining what is the general connection. But that is not the best way to determine divine truth. And the reason why is that while there is huge amounts of divine truth present on the earth, very few people can feel God's love or feel God's love enter them, and so therefore are unable to understand divine truth very easily. So there has to be another process that we have to engage to understand divine truth. And for that reason, I feel divine truth is a different substance or a different quality to it than truth, absolute truth itself has, in the sense that divine truth requires the reception of divine love for it to be completely understood. Whereas other truth is just, we can understand it through a process of deduction or experimentation quite easily. Yeah. The same applies with the process of the quality of humility that God has, I feel. If you look at the quality of humility in people, it's often what I would feel is self-denigration rather than humility. Humility involves an aspect of humility, an attribute of humility is modesty. And modesty involves not just seeing yourself as a terrible creation of God, but rather seeing yourself as you truly are, a wonderful creation of God. So you can actually be modest and say, I am wonderful. And that is also humble to say such a thing. So the quality of humility that people believe humility to be on the earth is often very different to what I see in God and what I've felt from God in terms of God's nature in my interaction with my relationship with God. And the same goes with the quality of power. The quality of power obviously can exist without God, in the sense that we have personal power that God has given to us and given us the right, right is probably not the best term to use. He's given us the will to be able to use that personal power in a direction that we decide. In other words, based on our desire. This power comes from within us, and we can grow in power in some areas, and we can reduce in power in other areas. It also makes sense that both of those things are available to God. But again, God's power is never used out of harmony with love. So therefore, God's attribute and quality with regard to power is very different to our own. What we see our power, in terms of human power, is it is very frequently used out of harmony with love. So therefore, it must have a different quality or a different attribute than God's. God's power is never used out of harmony with love. The same goes with humility that is becoming or a part of God's nature. God's humility is never used out of harmony with love. God never self-degrades, never degrades herself in any interaction with any person or individual or any person who she's created in particular. But we often see people who are so-called humble on earth denigrating themselves in order to prove their humility. God doesn't do that. The same applies to truth. If we look at God's truth always involves love, divine love in some aspect of it. And this goes from the physical truths that we can discover right the way through to all sorts of very complicated truths emotionally that we can discover, and truths about the universe themselves and how it's created, the laws that construct the universe and so forth. There's all this love inherent in every single one of those qualities. On earth, you can discover truth without love, right? So that tells me that the nature of truth within the individual is very different to the nature of truth that comes from God, divine truth. So you could say every one of these qualities that I'm now describing about God, you've got divine truth, which is very, very different to human truth. We've got divine humility, which is very, very different in its nature to human humility. And we've got divine power, which is very different in its nature to the way humans exercise power. And so this tells me that the nature of God is far more advanced than our own nature. Because every single quality we look at that is inherent within ourselves, which also must be inherent within God when we examine the universe, we can see the proof of that, is very, very different the way it's displayed. And it's always displayed with the underlying feeling of love throughout and inherent in every single of these other qualities that we can discover about God. And that's why I feel discovering God's love is the most important thing. Because once you discover God's love, all these other understandings come to you.
So all of these things you learned through receiving of divine love?
Yes, yes. And so, once I receive divine love to a certain point, see, I can have as a human. So, for example, yourself as a scientist, before you believed in God, so before you had any interaction with God as a scientist, you did have the quality of humility, to a degree, because you decided to investigate something that you didn't know, and it takes humility to do that, to say, I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and make some mistakes and investigate and experiment. That requires humility. You also had a desire for some kind of truth, didn't you, inside of you? Otherwise you would never have become a scientist, right? And you would never have discovered, you'd never have desired any more truth than what your parents had already taught you, that you would have believed is true, even though some of it is not. And so these kind of qualities had to be a part of you, inherent in your nature, before you started even the process of seeing whether divine love actually exists. But as divine love enters you, what I've found is a part of the divinity of all these other things enter you as well. And what that means then is that as God's love enters me, my flavour of humility changes. So while before I was only humble when it came to external matters, as soon as some of God's love enters me, I have become more humble about internal matters, about matters of the heart, how I feel. When I examine truth, I become more humble about what kind of truth I can examine. Before I would have gone, I can only examine truth about physical matters or physical things that I can scientifically measure. And now, as you are learning, you now can experiment and measure things that are beyond that are different to that would not normally be accepted as an acceptable way of discovering truth in a scientific community, that you can create scientific experiments and actually discover. And so the flavour of truth that you're open to changed. As soon as you discovered this first thing, the flavour of everything changes. And it all starts to change from being what we are personally capable of demonstrating as a quality coming from within ourselves into qualities that we're not personally able to demonstrate without God's love first infusing or coming into our soul and changing it and transforming it in some way.
So it's a bit like a snowball, like going down a mountain and picking up all these other bits as it goes along.
Exactly.
Growing and growing and growing.
Yeah. And it's just a wonderful thing about God's nature is that God's always sharing her nature through this love. So while I might have to have a few qualities inside of myself before I begin the process, once I begin the process of connecting with God, it starts transforming my soul's nature. It starts manipulating its form in terms of expansion, but also transforming its nature into something that wasn't originally created to actually be initially. And it's like now a transformational process of growth is going through, where the soul was only originally able to be this big without God, and then all of a sudden parts of God's nature particularly God's love, start entering it, and all of a sudden now the soul's got this as larger nature itself, and now has a part of God's nature in that particular quality. So you began with humility, obviously. To be a scientist you had to have some, but now you have far more humility than you had then. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because part of God's nature has entered you, and in that process you've gone, oh, well, but there's this and there's that and there's this and there's all these other things I could experiment with that I didn't know about before, and wow, and now you are far more open to more truth as a result of that. Does that make sense? And so what's going on inside of the human soul is this ability, as we receive this first part of God's nature, divine love, it has the ability for us to now begin absorbing other parts or characteristics of God's nature become a part of us as well. And I feel that's one amazing thing about God.
It's incredibly generous.
Exactly, which is another quality of divine love, generosity. Is it general?
Ish. I can't imagine.
Generosity is another part of love. And in fact, any person who receives a part of God's nature with regard to love will become automatically more generous. They'll become more generous with their time. They'll become more generous with their knowledge. They won't require a cost associated with their knowledge. They will never charge for their knowledge, and so forth. Automatically, that's a part of God's nature. God doesn't do that, and neither does any person who's become more godlike. So when a religion charges for something, or when a business charges for something, that tells you that they're yet to absorb part of divine love with regard to the way they operate. Because if they had of, they could no longer do such a thing. And what I like about that is there is a way to measure whether a person has actually become more divine in their nature by seeing whether they've become more like God in their nature and the way God operates with us. Yeah.
So it's a barometer for ourselves as well.
It is a barometer for ourselves. It's a barometer for our own progression. If we still, for example, give our time wanting something in return, then we know we've yet to receive a part of God's divine love that would cause us to stop doing that. A person who's received divine love to a certain degree would never do that anymore. Right? If I have tried to constrain you in some way, that's not loving to the environment or based on some kind of emotion of anger or frustration that I have with you, then I know I haven't received divine love. Because if I had of, I would have God's nature on that matter. What does God do with you? God doesn't punish you or try to constrain you just when you try to do something that is out of harmony with God. God has laws that correct you, So I would attempt to correct you still, but I wouldn't not love you anymore. I wouldn't be angry with you anymore. Could God? So that tells me that if you did something that I viewed as wrong, and I was angry with you as a result, now I obviously have some work to do with God's nature, because I've yet to receive God's nature properly. If I'm fully at one with God, I would never be angry with you, no matter what you chose to do. Even if you chose to kill me, I'd still not be angry with you. Does that make sense? And that would tell me that I have now received a lot of God's nature, to the point where I'm now at one or the same way of feeling on that particular matter as God is. Yeah.
So with the other attributes, there's intelligence, there's like logical reasoning.
So let's look at it. Yeah. So let's call it. Should we call that intelligence then? Yeah. Yep. Wisdom. Wisdom. Wisdom is different to intelligence in that we can be very intelligent and have no wisdom at all. Wisdom is the way we apply intelligence. It's the way intelligence is used. And God certainly obviously has that to an infinite amount, considering how He's built our bodies and our souls and our interaction with every single thing. There's huge amounts of wisdom inside of the creation of God's intelligence. So I feel they are separate qualities of God, yes.
And
So just
it seems to work that the more you grow in love, these things, I mean, you grow in these attributes as well, regardless of whether they were getting them from God, but they just seem to be like the higher you are in love, the more wise and more humble you are.
And the more intelligent you become.
And it's not just because you're getting the attributes from God, it's an expression of the love.
Well, what happens inside of ourselves as we receive the divine love is it transforms the way all of our natural qualities and attributes, because we can have all of these qualities and attributes naturally ourselves inside of our soul occurring without having any connection with God. As I said, before I met you, you had the quality of desire for truth and desire for humility already within your soul. Otherwise, you could never have taken on the job of being a scientist. Would never have been available to you if you didn't have some of those qualities, right? And also intelligent obviously had to be there. You had to intellectually understand what you were examining, and so there has to be some level of intelligence available to you to even do that. And so obviously some of those qualities existed, but as divine love enters you, these qualities change in their flavour. They change in the way in which you express them, and they also expand in their ability to be utilised and also understood. And so, yes, you now have a far larger degree of wisdom, for example, as you receive divine love, because before you would have been very much like many scientists. You very much when I first met you, very much sort of intellectually examining everything, very little connection with your own emotion, very little what I would call an emotional intelligence. You didn't really understand yourself very well in terms of what was going on in your life, in terms of your relationships and all those kind of things. Your work life was fine, but all the other bits were difficult, right? And so obviously there wasn't much emotional intelligence there at the time. But then as you receive divine love, all of a sudden you start growing this emotional intelligence. You start saying, I can feel that from this person. That's different to what they're telling me. I'm feeling this. If I act upon what they're telling me, I'll get myself in trouble. If I act on what I'm feeling from them now, I'll be in far more harmony with, I won't have as much trouble in my life. And so as we work our way through and receive some more of this love from God, we find ourselves expanding in all of these other ways in terms of we're becoming more like God in other ways. That's what it really feels like. So we receive. So here's our soul, our half of the soul. We receive some divine love, and now all of a sudden we're more truthful, we're more humble, we have a bit more power to exercise, we have more intelligence, and we have more wisdom. That's what I said in the first century. All these other things will be added to you. And most people, when they read that, they don't really understand completely what that means. What I'm saying is, all these other qualities that we often try to develop singularly or separately can be added to you as you receive this love. And this is the amazing thing about the love, is the love has a power of its own that seems to manipulate all other qualities. And that in itself is an amazing fact. if we examine that. So what we're basically saying is that if I want to grow any quality inside of my own personal nature, the fastest way for that to grow is by my receiving and acting upon the love that I receive from God. And if I do that, then all of these other things will grow automatically as well. And I have the ability to expand. The love sort of is like the food of expansion in all these other areas as well. So while these are different qualities of God, as I said, every single one of these qualities in God has God's love as a part of the quality.
And so as you grow, you can actually get to know God by seeing how you change yourself.
Exactly.
And so that's how you discovered it all.
Exactly.
Cool.
That's the experiment.
Yeah.
The real experiment is not the experiments that we can do externally. The real experiment is the experiment that we do with our soul. And if we engage that experiment with God, we can receive this divine love and then measure our own condition over a period of time in different areas, like our humility, our power, intelligence, wisdom. We could start writing down, couldn't we, hundreds and hundreds of different qualities that we'd like to develop within ourselves: kindness, compassion, mercy, generosity, all these other love-based qualities, intelligence, understanding, knowledge, all these intellectual-based qualities. We can write power, desire, passion, all those things that are involved in power. We could write down all of those qualities, and then we can experiment. We could say, right, let's take a photograph of us emotionally. Let's write down today how we are with all those particular things. And then in a year's time, after we've experimented with receiving divine love, let's take another photograph emotionally by writing down all of how we feel about these same things now. And have we noticed change? Now, if we haven't noticed change, what I'm saying is you've not received divine love. If you've noticed change in a positive direction, then you've definitely received some. If you've been longing for it, you've definitely received some. Now, it is possible for a person to change without receiving divine love, but what happens with divine love is the change is far more rapid. So I've seen people in the spirit world like change on an issue of generosity over 1,000 years. You know, where 1,000 years ago they weren't very generous at all, and now 1,000 years later they now learnt to be generous, right? But I've seen a person change who received divine love in 2 minutes between those two conditions, right, in terms of earth time. So that tells me that the power of receiving divine love on the soul has far more expression than if I try to develop the quality myself without love, without God's love involved. Yeah.
So it's passion and desire, they are within us, but they are also can come from, they're attributes of God as well, and they can also grow as well? Definitely.
So if you think of power, inside of power there are different qualities of power. Passion is one of the qualities of power. Desire is one of the qualities of power, and so forth. There are others, of course, which we can list. But if we look at those particular qualities, as I receive divine love, these grow. So my passion for the universe grows. My desires for things that are in harmony with love grow. The desire for things out of harmony with love shrinks automatically as well. So, you know, before I might have desired to harm people, now I don't anymore, because my desire out of harmony with love shrinks. And so therefore how I use my power comes more and more into harmony with how God expresses her power. And this is what happens with every quality. So you can list all sorts of qualities that God has. They all have sub-attributes, right? Then as we receive divine love, we'll notice these things changing in us, and they become more godlike in their expression, or more loving in their expression automatically, not something we try to do. You know, it's not like I have to educate myself. Oh, I've got to remember to be more loving. It's not like that at all. It's automatic. So when we've got to say, oh, I've got to be more loving here, I've got to be, oh, no, it's best for me to work out how to be more loving here, when we're not understanding, right? Because the reality is, as we receive divine love, we don't have to work it out anymore. It's automatic. Passion is automatic. Desire is automatic. Desire in harmony with love is more automatic, and desire in harmony with, in disharmony with love becomes less automatic, to the point where it can't even exist at all. I can't even do anything out of harmony with love once I become at one with God. I can't. It's impossible to do anything with it. It's physically impossible for me to do it. And this is the beauty of receiving love as the primary connection with God, is that as we receive love, then all of these other qualities all develop and become more harmonious with that with divinity. So they're no longer in harmony with how I would do it. They're now in harmony with how God does it.